Hello, and a very warm, heartfelt welcome to each and every one of you. I invite you to pause for a moment to truly contemplate the almost unfathomable, boundless ocean of human knowledge that envelops us in the 21st century. Every intricate scientific theory, every nuanced philosophical discourse, every poem that plucks at the strings of the human soul, every meticulously documented historical event, every symphony, every folk song, every blueprint, every forgotten recipe. All of this and so much more constitutes our collective intellectual and cultural inheritance. It's a dynamic, ever-expanding testament to millennia of human curiosity, creativity, struggle, and achievement. But how did we as a species navigate the vast expanse of time from the ephemeral echoes of spoken words and the fragile, limited confines of individual memory to our current, globally interconnected reality, where immense libraries of information are, for a significant portion of humanity, merely a few keystrokes or a voice command away? Today, we are embarking on an ambitious, panoramic, and deeply fascinating journey through the winding corridors of time. Our purpose is to explore, in considerable detail, one of humanity's most persistent, most vital, and often most dramatically contested undertakings, the intricate history of libraries, and the unceasing, often heroic, quest for knowledge preservation. Our grand odyssey will transport us from the legendary sun-drenched halls and papyrus-laden shelves of ancient Alexandria, a beacon of learning in the classical world. We will then traverse the centuries to the hushed, candle-lit scriptoria of medieval monasteries where dedicated hands kept the flame of knowledge alive through dark and turbulent times. We will bear witness to the earth-shattering, society-reshaping impact of the printing press, a technological revolution that democratized information in ways previously unimaginable. And finally, we will navigate the dazzling, multifaceted, and at times profoundly disorienting currents of our contemporary digital age, an era of unprecedented access and equally unprecedented challenges. This is a narrative woven with the brilliant threads of human innovation, the steadfast cords of unwavering dedication, the somber strands of heartbreaking destruction, and the inspiring motifs of resilient rebirth. It is, at its very essence, the story of how we, as human beings, have relentlessly, and often against formidable odds, striven to remember, to learn, to understand our world and our place within it, and to share that understanding across generations and cultures. But before we immerse ourselves fully in this grand tapestry of historical exploration, I would genuinely cherish the opportunity to connect with each of you, the wonderful, engaged community tuning in to share this experience. How? Has your day been unfolding? No, truly, I mean it. Please take a brief moment, pause this video if you wish, and drop a comment in the section below. Let me know what's been occupying your thoughts and your time in your particular corner of the world. The triumphs, the challenges, the everyday moments, the unexpected surprises. And while you're at it, I would be absolutely fascinated and inspired to hear about one specific goal, one aspiration that you are currently nurturing for your future. It could be a monumental life change, or a small personal ambition, a professional milestone you're striving for, or a creative project you're hoping to bring to life. Sharing these aspirations, I firmly believe, builds a wonderful, supportive sense of community and provides a wellspring of collective inspiration. So please do take a moment to share. I will be eagerly and thoughtfully reading through all of your comments later on. Right then, now that we've had a chance to connect on a more personal level, let us commence our in-depth exploration into the very foundations of how we, as a species, have come to know what we know, and how we have endeavored to ensure that this knowledge endures. Our story, perhaps somewhat counterintuitively, does not begin with imposing architectural marvels or meticulously catalogued collections housed within grand edifices. Instead, it commences in the deep mists of prehistory with the very genesis of human communication and the earliest forms of collective memory. For countless millennia, stretching far back into the Paleolithic era, knowledge was an ethereal, intangible entity, a living current transmitted primarily through the intricate and resilient networks of oral tradition. Imagine small nomadic bands or early settled communities gathered around flickering hearth fires, the faces of the young illuminated with curiosity and awe as they listened, rapt, to the elders of their group. Stories of creation, explaining the origins of the world and their people. Epic poems recounting the deeds of ancestral heroes and the interventions of powerful deities. Complex genealogies meticulously tracing ancestral lines and kinship obligations. Vital, practical information about hunting techniques, edible and medicinal plants, safe water sources, seasonal weather patterns, tool-making, and crucial social customs, laws, and rituals. All of this, the very fabric of their culture and survival, was entrusted to the power and fidelity of the spoken word. The storyteller, the shaman, the tribal elder, the bard, the griot in West African traditions, these individuals were the living libraries, the animate archives of their respective peoples. Their trained memories were the repositories of wisdom. Their eloquent voices were the catalogs and the means of dissemination. Their often dramatic and engaging performances were the method of ensuring that this knowledge was not only transmitted, but also understood and internalized by the next generation. Consider the sophisticated mnemonic devices they must have employed, intricate patterns of rhythm and rhyme, formulaic phrases, vivid imagery, compelling narrative structures, call and response techniques, and perhaps even accompanying music or dance, all meticulously designed to aid recall and ensure the accurate transmission of complex information across successive generations. This was knowledge preservation in its most primal, most intimate, and most profoundly human form. However, human memory, for all its remarkable capacity for storage and retrieval, is inherently fallible. It is susceptible to unintentional distortion, to embellishment, to selective forgetting, and ultimately it is finite, inextricably bound to the lifespan of the individual knowledge keeper. The death of an elder or a storyteller without a fully trained successor could mean the irretrievable loss of vast swathes of accumulated wisdom. As societies gradually began to grow in size, density, and complexity, as agriculture led to more settled lifestyles, as social structures became more hierarchical, and as the sheer volume of essential knowledge expanded, the inherent limitations of purely oral transmission became increasingly apparent and problematic. The need for a more permanent, more tangible, and less fallible record of information became not just a desire, but a pressing societal and administrative necessity. This profound and growing need acted as a powerful catalyst for one of the most significant and transformative turning points in the entire trajectory of human history: the independent invention and development of writing systems. This was not a singular, isolated event, but rather a gradual, complex process of evolution that appears to have occurred independently or through processes of stimulus diffusion in several different parts of the ancient world. Around 5500 CE, years ago in the Fertile Crescent of Mesopotamia, the region between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, the Sumerians developed one of the earliest known writing systems, cuneiform. Initially, this system was largely pictographic, with simplified drawings representing objects or concepts. Over centuries, however, these pictographs evolved into more abstract, stylized, wedge-shaped marks, which were impressed with a reed, stylus onto tablets of wet clay. These clay tablets, once inscribed, were then typically dried in the sun or, for more important documents intended for long-term preservation, baked in a kiln, making them remarkably durable. And what did these ancient Sumerians, and later the Akkadians, Babylonians, and Assyrians who adopted and adapted cuneiform, record on these tablets? They recorded far more than simple tallies or inventories. We find extensive administrative records detailing economic transactions, land ownership, and temple accounts. We find comprehensive legal codes, such as the famous Code of Hammurabi from Babylon, circa 1754 BCE, which prescribed laws and punishments for a wide range of offenses. We find rich literary traditions, including epic poems like the Epic of Gilgamesh, which explores themes of heroism, mortality, and the search for meaning, creation myths like the Enuma Elish, hymns to gods and goddesses, and wisdom literature offering moral and practical advice. We also find evidence of sophisticated mathematical calculations, including multiplication tables, and solutions to geometric problems, detailed astronomical observations used for calendrical and divinatory purposes, medical texts describing symptoms and remedies, and even personal letters offering glimpses into the daily lives and concerns of individuals. Archaeologists have unearthed vast archives of these cuneiform tablets, such as those found at sites like Ebla in modern-day Syria, dating back to the 3rd millennium BCE, Nineveh, the library of Ashurbanipal in the 7th century BCE, containing tens of thousands of tablets, including literary and scholarly texts, and Uruk. These collections, sometimes numbering in the tens of thousands of tablets, provide an unparalleled and invaluable window into the complex political, economic, social, religious, and intellectual workings of these early urban civilizations. These were, in essence, some of the earliest systematic and institutionalized efforts at large-scale record-keeping and knowledge accumulation, the very proto-libraries of humankind. Other early writing systems emerged in different regions. The enigmatic Indus Valley script, circa 2600 to 1900 BCE, which remains largely undeciphered despite numerous attempts. Early Chinese characters incised on oracle bones, animal bones, and turtle shells used for divination during the Shang dynasty, circa 1600-1046 BCE, and later cast on bronze vessels, and somewhat later, the complex hieroglyphic writing systems of Mesoamerican civilizations like the Maya, which recorded dynastic histories, astronomical data, and religious beliefs on stone monuments, ceramics, and codices made from bark paper. Each of these independent inventions of writing represented a monumental cognitive leap, a powerful new technology that allowed human ideas, knowledge, and culture to transcend the limitations of individual memory and the confines of immediate time and space, contemporaneously with, or perhaps emerging slightly later than, the initial developments in Mesopotamia. Another profound and influential transformation in communication technology was taking place in ancient Egypt, along the fertile and life-giving banks of the Nile River. Here, the ancient Egyptians developed their own intricate and aesthetically beautiful writing system known as hieroglyphs, a visually rich and complex script that combined logographic symbols representing whole words, syllabic symbols representing syllables, and alphabetic symbols representing individual sounds, elements. Hieroglyphs were typically used for monumental inscriptions on temples and tombs, and for important religious texts. Alongside the formal hieroglyphic script, the Egyptians also developed more cursive forms for everyday use. Hieratic script, a simplified version of hieroglyphs written with a reed pen on papyrus, and later Demotic script, an even more abbreviated and cursive form that became common in the late period. Crucially for the history of libraries and portable records, the Egyptians also pioneered and perfected the use of papyrus as a primary writing surface. Papyrus was manufactured from the processed stems of the Cyperus papyrus plant, a tall reed that grew in abundance in the marshy regions of the Nile Delta. The process of making papyrus was itself a skilled craft. The plant's pith was cut into thin strips, which were then laid in 2 perpendicular layers, pressed together, and dried in the sun to form smooth, light-colored, and remarkably durable sheets. These individual sheets could then be joined together, edge to edge, to create long rolls or scrolls, sometimes extending for many meters. Scribes, who underwent rigorous training from a young age and formed a highly respected and essential professional class in Egyptian society, meticulously recorded a vast and diverse array of information onto these papyrus scrolls. This included sacred religious texts like the Book of the Dead, a collection of spells and prayers intended to guide the deceased through the afterlife, detailed governmental decrees, administrative records, tax rolls, and legal documents. Literary works including stories like the Tale of Sinuhe, poems, and wisdom literature offering moral instruction, and important scientific and medical knowledge. The famous papyrus Ebers, for instance, dating to around 1550 BCE, is one of the oldest and most comprehensive surviving medical documents from ancient Egypt, containing over 700 magical formulas and folk remedies, as well as observations on anatomy, physiology, and disease. The Rhind mathematical papyrus, circa 1550 BCE, provides insights into Egyptian mathematics, including arithmetic, algebra, geometry, and trigonometry. Temple libraries, often referred to as houses of life, per Ankh, and royal archives began to emerge as distinct institutions. These were not merely passive storage facilities for scrolls, they were active centers of learning, scribal training, the production of new texts, and the preservation of cultural and religious heritage. Access to these collections was typically restricted to priests, officials, and, of course, the scribes themselves. But when we speak of the great libraries of antiquity, one name, above all others, resonates through the corridors of history with an almost mythical, legendary aura, a name that has become synonymous with the grandest aspirations of universal knowledge and the pinnacle of classical learning, the Great Library of Alexandria. Founded in the bustling cosmopolitan city of Alexandria, Egypt in the early 3rd century BCE, most likely by Ptolemy IV Soter, one of Alexander the Great's most trusted generals and his successor as ruler of Egypt, or possibly by his son and successor, Ptolemy II. Philadelphus, the Library of Alexandria, was conceived with an ambition that continues to inspire and awe us even today. Its stated goal was nothing less than to collect all the knowledge of the known world, to acquire copies of every significant scroll from every culture and in every language. It was intrinsically and inextricably linked to the Mausion, or Shrine, of the Muses, a research institution that was, in many respects, the ancient world's equivalent of a modern university or advanced research institute. This remarkable complex, patronized and lavishly funded by the Ptolemaic dynasty, attracted a dazzling constellation of the most brilliant scholars, poets, scientists, mathematicians, astronomers, geographers, physicians, and philosophers from across the entire Hellenistic world, transforming Alexandria into the undisputed intellectual and cultural capital of its time for several centuries. The Mausion provided salaries, lodging, and tax exemptions for its resident scholars, allowing them to dedicate themselves to research, writing, and teaching. Imagine, if you will, the vibrant intellectual atmosphere of this institution. Brilliant minds from diverse backgrounds strolling through colonnaded porticos, engaged in fervent debate and scholarly discourse, unrolling precious papyrus scrolls that held the accumulated wisdom of ages. The library itself was said to have employed a remarkably aggressive, even coercive acquisitions policy to build its unparalleled collection. According to accounts from later writers like Galen, any ship docking in the busy international port of Alexandria was systematically searched by officials, and any books or scrolls found aboard were confiscated. These texts were then taken to the library to be meticulously copied by a large staff of highly skilled scribes. In many cases, the original scrolls were retained for the library's permanent collection, and the newly made copies were returned to their somewhat unfortunate original owners. This practice, if accurately reported, demonstrates an extraordinary commitment to comprehensive collection development. Beyond this rather forceful method, agents of the library were dispatched throughout the Mediterranean basin, and even further. A field to actively purchase scrolls and diplomatic gifts exchanged between rulers often included valuable and rare texts for the library. Ptolemy III. Euergetes, for example, is said to have borrowed the official Athenian state copies of the tragedies of Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, promising a large sum of money as surety for their return. He then had exquisite copies made. On the finest papyrus, kept the originals for the Library of Alexandria, and sent the copies back to Athens, forfeiting the deposit. Estimates of the sheer size of the Library of Alexandria's collection vary dramatically in ancient and modern sources, ranging from a more conservative figure of around 40,000 scrolls to a truly staggering 400,000, or perhaps even as many as 700,000 scrolls at its zenith. Such a collection, regardless of the precise number, would have represented an unparalleled and unprecedented concentration of human thought, creativity, and scientific knowledge in one location. The roster of scholars who worked, studied, or taught at the Mausoleum and utilized the library's resources reads like a who's who of ancient intellectual giants. Euclid, whose Elements laid the systematic foundations of geometry that remained unchallenged for over 2 millennia, likely taught and wrote in Alexandria. Eratosthenes of Cyrene, who served as the chief librarian for a significant period. In the 3rd century BCE, was a polymath of extraordinary ability. He famously calculated the circumference of the earth with astonishing accuracy, using simple geometry, measurements of shadows, and observations of the sun's angle at different latitudes. He also created a sophisticated map of the known world and developed a chronology of historical events. Archimedes of Syracuse, the brilliant physicist, mathematician, and inventor, renowned for his work on buoyancy, levers, and siege engines, is said to have studied or visited Alexandria and corresponded with scholars there. Callimachus of Cyrene, a highly influential poet and scholar who also worked at the library, undertook the monumental and groundbreaking task of creating the pinakes, meaning tablets or lists. This was far more than a simple inventory, and it was a comprehensive, critical, and systematically organized catalog of the library's extensive holdings, likely comprising some 120 scrolls itself. The pinakes organized works by genre, e.g. poetry, history, philosophy, medicine, then by author, and provided biographical information about the authors, titles of their works, the first line of each work, incipit, and sometimes a summary or a critical assessment. This was a foundational achievement in the history of library science, establishing principles of cataloging, bibliography, and bibliographic control that profoundly influenced scholarship for centuries and laid the groundwork for how libraries organize knowledge even today. Other luminaries associated with Alexandria included Hipparchus of Nicaea, often considered the greatest astronomer of antiquity, who developed the first comprehensive star catalog, made precise measurements of the lunar and solar year, and made significant contributions to trigonometry. Hero of Alexandria, a brilliant engineer and inventor whose creations included early steam-powered devices, the aeolipile, automata, and surveying instruments, and numerous grammarians, literary critics, medical researchers, Herophilus and Erostratus, for example, are said to have performed human dissections there, advancing anatomical knowledge, and textual scholars who worked on establishing definitive editions of classical Greek texts, particularly Homer. The tragic and complex fate of the great library of Alexandria, its gradual decline and ultimate disappearance, is shrouded in layers of historical accounts, myth, scholarly debate, and considerable uncertainty. It was almost certainly not a single cataclysmic event, as popular imagination often portrays it, but rather a protracted series of destructive episodes, periods of neglect and shifting political and cultural tides spanning several centuries. The first significant blow often cited in historical narratives is attributed to Julius Caesar in 48 BCE. During his military campaign in Alexandria and his involvement in the Ptolemaic dynastic struggle, a fire he ordered to destroy enemy ships in the harbor reportedly spread to parts of the city, damaging a warehouse near the docks that may have contained a large number of scrolls, perhaps tens of thousands, possibly intended for export or part of an overflow collection of the August Library. However, most contemporary scholars believe that the main library building and the Mouseion itself likely survived this incident relatively intact or were quickly repaired. Later, in the 3rd century CE, the Bruchion district of Alexandria, where the main royal library and the Mouseion were located, suffered extensive and severe damage during periods of intense civil strife and military conflict, particularly during the Emperor Aurelian's reconquest of Alexandria from the Palmyrene Empire under Queen Zenobia in 272 CE. This period of urban warfare and destruction undoubtedly led to significant losses for the library's collections and infrastructure. Then, in 391 CE, a pivotal and highly symbolic event occurred which marked a turning point. The Serapeum, a magnificent temple complex dedicated to the Greco-Egyptian god Serapis, which also housed a significant daughter library or a substantial public collection that may have served as an annex to the main library, was destroyed or forcibly repurposed by order of Theophilus, the zealous Christian patriarch of Alexandria. This act was part of a broader, empire-wide campaign by increasingly assertive Christian authorities, empowered by imperial decrees from emperors like Theodosius I, to suppress paganism and dismantle its institutions throughout the Roman Empire. While the exact size and nature of the Serapeum's collection at that time are debated by historians, its destruction or conversion represented a profound cultural loss and a clear signal of the shifting religious and intellectual landscape of late antiquity, where classical pagan learning was increasingly viewed with suspicion by some Christian factions. Finally, there is the highly contested, controversial, and often sensationalized account concerning the Arab conquest of Alexandria in 642 CE under General Amr ibn al-As, acting on the orders of Caliph Omar. According to a story that first appears in sources written several centuries after the event, notably by the 13th century Christian writer Bar Hebraeus, citing earlier accounts, Caliph Omar, when asked by Amr what should be done with the remaining scrolls of the ancient library, supposedly declared, "If these writings of the Greeks agree with the Book of God, the Quran, they are useless and need not be preserved. If they disagree, they are pernicious and ought to be destroyed." Following this alleged decree, the scrolls were then said to have been distributed to the city's numerous public bathhouses to be used as fuel for heating the water, a process that, according to the legend, took 6 months to complete. However, most modern historians and scholars of Islamic history view this particular account with considerable skepticism, if not outright dismissal. It appears in sources written long after the supposed event, often by authors with potential biases, and there's little or no contemporary evidence from either Arab or Coptic sources of the 7th century to support such a dramatic and widespread destruction of books at that time. It is far more likely that the bulk of the Great Library's original vast collection had already been lost, dispersed, stolen, damaged by neglect, or destroyed through the earlier incidents of fire, warfare, and religious conflict over the preceding centuries. The gradual decline of Alexandria as the preeminent center of Hellenistic learning, coupled with the rise of Constantinople and other intellectual centers, also likely contributed to the library's fading significance long before the Arab conquest. Regardless of the precise sequence of events and the exact causes of its ultimate demise, the loss of the Library of Alexandria, whether sudden or gradual, remains a potent and enduring symbol in Western culture. It symbolizes the inherent fragility of knowledge, the devastating and irreversible consequences of war, political instability, ideological intolerance, and simple neglect, and the immense cultural treasures and intellectual heritage that can vanish from human memory if not actively and diligently preserved. Yet its legend, its grand and noble ambition to encompass all human wisdom, endured through the ages, becoming a powerful and recurring inspiration for countless subsequent generations of scholars, librarians, and patrons of learning, fueling the persistent dream of creating a universal repository of human knowledge. Alexandria, though undoubtedly unparalleled in its scale and ambition, was not entirely alone in its fervent pursuit of knowledge and the establishment of grand libraries. In the Hellenistic world, the Library of Pergamum, located in the prosperous capital city of the Attalid Kingdom in Asia Minor, modern-day Bergama, Turkey, emerged as a significant and ambitious rival to Alexandria, particularly during the 2nd century BCE. Founded by King Eumenes II, the Library of Pergamum reportedly amassed an impressive collection estimated by Plutarch to contain around 200,000 scrolls. It was situated within the Acropolis of Pergamum, near the Temple of Athena. It was here, according to a story recounted by the Roman natural historian Pliny the Elder, that parchment, vellum, a writing material made from treated animal skins, typically sheep, goat, or calf, was significantly refined and popularized as a direct result of this rivalry. The legend states that Egypt, under the Ptolemies, seeking to hinder the growth and prestige of Pergamum's library and maintain its own dominance in the intellectual sphere, embargoed or severely restricted the export of papyrus to Pergamum. In response to this papyrus shortage, the resourceful Pergamenes developed and perfected the techniques for producing high-quality parchment. Parchment offered several advantages over papyrus. It was generally more durable and robust, less susceptible to moisture and tearing, and its smoother surface could be written on both sides, opistography, making it more economical for longer texts. Crucially, the ink on parchment could also be scraped off using a knife, allowing the expensive material to be reused for new writing. This created what we now call a palimpsest, a manuscript with layers of writing where earlier erased texts can sometimes be recovered using modern imaging techniques. This innovation of parchment would prove to be of vital importance for the preservation and transmission of texts throughout the Middle Ages, especially in Europe, where papyrus was not readily available. The rivalry between Alexandria and Pergamum, therefore, spurred not only competition in collecting scrolls, but also innovation in the very materials of knowledge, as the Roman Republic, and later the mighty Roman Empire, rose to dominate the Mediterranean. World and beyond, it absorbed, adapted, and often emulated many aspects of Greek Hellenistic culture, including its deep reverence for learning, literature, and the institution of libraries. Wealthy and educated Romans, such as the renowned orator and philosopher Marcus Tullius Cicero, the wealthy general and gourmand Lucullus, who opened his extensive library to scholars, and the scholar and publisher Titus Pomponius Atticus, often amassed substantial private libraries. These collections, filled with both Greek and Latin scrolls, were not merely for personal use, but also served as symbols of status, culture, intellectual refinement, and political influence. Pliny the Younger, a Roman senator and writer of the Hague, late 1st and early 2nd century CE, wrote with great affection and pride about his own carefully curated library and the solace and intellectual stimulation he found in reading and study. He even endowed a public library in his hometown of Comum. The idea of public libraries, accessible to a wider segment of the educated populace, also took firm root in Rome. Julius Caesar, during his dictatorship, had ambitious plans to establish a grand public library in Rome, modeled on Alexandria, and entrusted the task of organizing it to the learned polymath Marcus Terentius Varro. However, Caesar's assassination in 44 BCE prevented the full realization of this project. The first truly public library in Rome was actually established by Gaius Asinius Pollio around 39 BCE, using the spoils from his military campaigns. He housed it in the Atrium Libertatis. Later, Roman emperors, recognizing the cultural prestige and practical utility of libraries, founded several significant imperial libraries in the capital. Emperor Augustus established 2 public libraries, one on the Palatine Hill near the Temple of Apollo, and another in the Porticus Octaviae. Perhaps the most renowned of the Roman imperial libraries was the Bibliotheca Ulpia, Ulpian Library, located in Trajan's Forum and completed around 112 CE under Emperor Trajan. This magnificent library consisted of 2 separate symmetrical halls, one dedicated to Greek works and the other to Latin works, with a central courtyard housing Trajan's Column. These Roman libraries, while certainly housing important Greek texts and valuing Greek scholarship, naturally placed a greater emphasis on Latin literature, Roman law, a field in which Rome excelled, Roman history, rhetoric, and administrative documents, reflecting the cultural identity and practical needs of the sprawling empire. They served not only scholars and officials, but also the educated public, contributing to the vibrant intellectual and literary life of Rome and other major cities throughout the empire, which often had their own municipal libraries. The architecture of these libraries often featured niches in the walls, armaria, for storing scrolls, reading rooms, and sometimes statues of Minerva or famous authors. However, with the gradual political, economic, and military decline of the Western Roman Empire throughout the 4th and 5th centuries CE, culminating in its traditional fall in 476 CE, when the last Western Roman emperor, Romulus Augustulus, was deposed, much of Western Europe entered a prolonged period of profound instability, political fragmentation, economic disruption, and significant cultural transformation. This era, often perhaps somewhat misleadingly and pejoratively, referred to by later historians as the Dark Ages, a term now largely avoided by scholars in favor of early Middle Ages or late antiquity, witnessed the widespread decay of urban centers, the collapse of Roman administrative structures, and frequent warfare and invasions. In this turbulent environment, many of the great classical libraries, both public and private, were destroyed in conflicts, looted by invaders, or simply fell into neglect and disrepair as the societal infrastructure and patronage systems that supported them crumbled. Literacy, which had been relatively widespread among the Roman elite and even segments of the urban population, declined significantly in many parts of the West. It was a time of immense upheaval, cultural discontinuity, and the tangible, often irretrievable, loss of a vast portion of the classical intellectual and literary heritage. Yet, even in this challenging period, knowledge did not entirely vanish from the Western world. Like resilient embers glowing amidst the ashes of a fallen civilization, it found new, often isolated, and remarkably dedicated guardians. In Western Europe, during the early Middle Ages, roughly 5th to 10th centuries, the flickering flame of classical learning, literacy, and textual transmission was primarily and crucially kept alive within the often fortified and relatively secure walls of Christian monasteries. Monks, particularly those following the rule of Saint Benedict, which was formulated by Benedict of Nursia in the early 6th century and gradually became the dominant monastic rule in the West, played an absolutely indispensable role in this preservation effort. The Benedictine rule emphasized a balanced life of prayer, ora, and work, labora, and for many monks, a significant part of that labora included the scholarly and devotional labor of copying manuscripts. Monastic scriptoria, dedicated rooms or spaces within monasteries, specifically set aside for the painstaking work of writing and copying texts, became vital, if often small and isolated centers, for the preservation and transmission of both sacred and, to a lesser extent, secular texts from antiquity. Imagine the scene in a typical early medieval scriptorium, a hushed, often unheated room, perhaps lit by a few narrow windows or flickering oil lamps, with monks, their fingers often stiff with cold, hunched over sloping wooden desks for many hours each day. They meticulously transcribed texts, character by character, word by word, using quill pens carefully cut from bird feathers, often goose feathers, and ink that they frequently had to prepare themselves from ingredients like soot, carbon black, oak galls, a source of tannic acid, and gum arabic. They wrote primarily on expensive and laboriously prepared parchment or vellum, as papyrus, a product of Egypt, was no longer readily available or affordable in most parts of Western Europe. The process of creating a single manuscript copy of a substantial work like the Bible or a classical text was incredibly slow, laborious, physically demanding, and required intense concentration and skill. Errors could easily creep in during transcription, and the quality of the copies varied, depending on the skill of the scribe and the quality of the exemplar, the manuscript being copied. Some manuscripts produced were simple and unadorned, intended primarily for study, liturgical use, or daily reading within the monastery. Others, however, particularly those commissioned by wealthy patrons or intended for important ceremonial purposes, were lavishly and exquisitely decorated with intricate ornamental initials, decorative borders, and miniature illustrations, illuminations, often using precious materials like gold leaf, silver, and vibrant pigments made from ground minerals or exotic plants. These illuminated manuscripts, such as the Lindisfarne Gospels or the Book of Kells, are now treasured not only as historical documents, but also as supreme masterpieces of medieval art and craftsmanship. Monks in these scriptoria copied not only the Bible, in its Latin Vulgate translation by St. Jerome, the writings of the early Church Fathers, like Augustine, Jerome, Ambrose, and Gregory the Great, and other theological and devotional works, but also, crucially, for the continuity of Western culture, a selection of classical Latin texts by authors such as Virgil, whose Aeneid was widely read and admired, Cicero, for his rhetoric and philosophy, Ovid, despite his often pagan and erotic themes, Horace, Seneca, Livy, and Sallust. The survival of many of these classical works into the modern era is directly attributable to the patient labor of these monastic scribes. Important monastic centers of learning and manuscript production included Monte Cassino in Italy, founded by St. Benedict himself and a major center for the preservation of classical texts. St. Gall in Switzerland, renowned for its library and a famous 9th century plan showing an ideal monastic layout, including a dedicated library and scriptorium. Bobbio in northern Italy, founded by the Irish monk St. Columbanus, and known for its rich collection of ancient manuscripts. Luxeuil and Corbie in Francia, Fulda in Germany, associated with St. Boniface and Rabanus Maurus, and Wearmouth Jarrow in Northumbria, England, the home of the Venerable Bede, one of the greatest scholars of the early Middle Ages. Irish monks, in particular, played an extraordinary and disproportionately significant role in the preservation and dissemination of learning during this period. Ireland, having never been conquered by the Romans, had developed a unique and vibrant Christian culture with a strong indigenous scholarly tradition that fused Christian learning with elements of pre-Christian Celtic culture. From the 6th to the 8th centuries, Irish missionaries and scholars known as peregrini, pilgrims for Christ, traveled extensively across continental Europe which was then struggling with the aftermath of the Roman Empire's collapse. They founded numerous influential monasteries in places like Francia, Germany, Switzerland, and Italy, e.g. Luxeuil, St. Gall, Bobbio. These Irish monks were often highly educated, possessing a strong knowledge of Latin and sometimes even Greek, which had become rare in the West. They brought with them their distinctive style of manuscript illumination, characterized by intricate interlaced patterns, zoomorphic designs, and elaborate initial letters, as seen in masterpieces like the Book of Kells, created around 800 CE, possibly at Iona in Scotland and then Kells in Ireland, and the Book of Durrow. They also played a crucial role in reintroducing classical texts and a more rigorous scholarly tradition to parts of continental Europe where learning had declined. Later, during the Carolingian Renaissance in the late 8th and early 9th centuries, the Frankish Emperor Charlemagne, seeking to reform education, standardize religious practice, and create a more unified Christian empire, actively promoted learning and the systematic copying of texts. He gathered scholars from across Europe to his court at Aachen, most notably Alcuin of York, an English scholar who played a key role in this revival. This period saw a significant increase in manuscript production, the establishment of new cathedral and monastic schools, and importantly, the development of a clearer, more legible, and standardized script known as Carolingian minuscule. This script, with its distinct letter forms and separation of words, greatly improved readability and became the basis for many later European handwriting styles, including the Roman typefaces we use today. Meanwhile, in the Eastern Mediterranean, the Byzantine Empire, with its magnificent capital in Constantinople, formerly Byzantium, modern-day Istanbul, maintained a more direct and continuous tradition of classical Greek scholarship, Roman law, and imperial administration. Unlike the Western Roman Empire, the Eastern Roman Byzantine Empire did not experience the same degree of societal collapse and fragmentation in the 5th century. It endured for another 1,000 years until the fall of Constantinople to the Ottoman Turks in 1453. Its libraries, most notably the Imperial Library of Constantinople, though its history is complex and it suffered from several destructive fires and periods of neglect, as well as patriarchal, monastic, and private libraries, managed to preserve a vast corpus of ancient Greek literature, philosophy, science, history, and Roman legal texts for over a millennium. Byzantine scholars diligently copied, studied, and commented upon these texts, producing important commentaries, encyclopedias like the 10th century Suda, anthologies like the Greek anthology, and historical chronicles. This continuous tradition of Greek learning in Byzantium acted as a vital cultural and intellectual reservoir, preserving Hellenic wisdom that would later flow back to Western Europe, particularly during the Italian Renaissance, through the migration of Byzantine scholars and the acquisition of Greek manuscripts, significantly fueling the revival of classical studies in the West, and then emerging from the Arabian Peninsula in the 7th century with astonishing speed and intellectual vigor. A new civilization rose to prominence, destined to become a dominant force in the preservation, synthesis, and advancement of knowledge for several centuries: the Islamic world. From roughly the 8th to the 13th centuries, a period often referred to by historians as the Islamic Golden Age, there was an extraordinary and multifaceted flourishing of science, mathematics, medicine, philosophy, astronomy, optics, chemistry, geography, cartography, and the arts across a vast territory stretching from Al-Andalus, Islamic Spain, and North Africa in the west, through the Middle East to Persia, Central Asia, and parts of India in the east. Central to this remarkable intellectual efflorescence was a profound cultural respect for knowledge, HILM, encouraged by verses in the Quran and sayings attributed to the Prophet Muhammad that emphasized the pursuit of learning. There was also a concerted and systematic effort to acquire, translate, and build upon the accumulated wisdom of earlier civilizations, particularly the Greeks, Persians, and Indians. A pivotal institution in this grand intellectual endeavor was the House of Wisdom, Beit al-Hikmah, in Baghdad, the newly founded capital of the Abbasid Caliphate. Established in the early 9th century, likely during the reign of Caliph Harun al-Rashid, and significantly expanded and institutionalized under his son, Caliph al-Ma'mun, the House of Wisdom was far more than just a library in the modern sense. It was a major state-sponsored intellectual center, an academy for scholars, a vast translation bureau, an astronomical observatory, and a repository for a growing collection of manuscripts from diverse cultures. Scholars from various religious and ethnic backgrounds, Muslim, Christian, often Syriac-speaking Nestorians, and Jacobites who were crucial intermediaries for Greek texts, Jewish, Zoroastrian, and even Sabians from Haran, who preserved Hellenistic, philosophical, and scientific traditions, collaborated there, engaging in translation, research, and debate. A massive and systematic translation movement was sponsored by the caliphs and wealthy patrons, lasting for over 2 centuries. Teams of highly skilled translators rendered vast numbers of Greek scientific and philosophical texts, including the works of Plato, Aristotle, whose logical and philosophical works became particularly influential, Euclid, Ptolemy, whose Almagest became the standard astronomical text, Galen and Hippocrates, foundational for medicine, Archimedes, and Apollonius of Perga into Arabic, often via intermediate Syriac translations. They also translated important Persian literary, historical, and administrative works, like the Pahlavi texts of Sasanian Persia, and Indian mathematical, astronomical, and medical texts, from which they adopted the Hindu numeral system, including the revolutionary concept of zero, which then became known as Hindu-Arabic numerals. This was not mere passive preservation or slavish imitation. Islamic scholars critically engaged with these translated texts, writing extensive commentaries, critiquing earlier theories, reconciling different philosophical traditions, and, crucially, making significant and original contributions that expanded the frontiers of knowledge in numerous fields. Think of towering intellectual figures like Muhammad ibn Musa al-Khwarizmi, circa 780-850, a Persian mathematician and astronomer at the Archives House of Wisdom, whose influential work, the compendious book on calculation by completion and balancing, Kitab al-Mukhtasar fi Hisab al-Jabr wal-Muqabala, provided systematic solutions for linear and quadratic equations, giving us the very term algebra, from the Arabic al-Jabr in the title. His work on arithmetic, based on the Indian system, was instrumental in popularizing Hindu-Arabic numerals throughout the Islamic world and later in Europe via Latin translations. Consider Avicenna, Abu Ali ibn Sina, 980-1037, a Persian polymath of astounding intellect, whose Canon of Medicine, Al-Qanun fit Tib, became a standard and authoritative medical textbook in both the Islamic world and Europe for over 6 centuries, and whose philosophical works, particularly the Book of Healing, Kitab al-Shifa, attempted a grand synthesis of Aristotelianism, Neoplatonism, and Islamic theology. Or Averroes, Abul Walid ibn Rushd, 1126-1198, an Andalusian philosopher, jurist, and physician from Cordoba, whose detailed and insightful commentaries on the works of Aristotle, earning him the title the commentator in medieval Europe, profoundly influenced Jewish philosophers like Maimonides and Christian scholastic thinkers like Thomas Aquinas, playing a key role in the revival of Aristotelian thought in the Latin West. Other giants of this era included Al-Kindi, circa 801-873, often called the philosopher of the Arabs, who sought to integrate Greek philosophy with Islamic thought. Al-Farabi, circa 872-950, a renowned logician, political philosopher, and music theorist. Razis, Abu Bakr al-Razi, circa 865–925, a pioneering Persian physician and chemist who made important contributions to clinical medicine, including distinguishing between smallpox and measles, and wrote extensively on ethics. And Al-Hasan, Abu Ali al-Hasan ibn al-Haytham, circa 965–1040, a brilliant Arab mathematician, astronomer, and physicist from Basra, who made groundbreaking contributions to optics, particularly the theory of vision, correctly arguing that light travels from objects to the eye, and emphasized the importance of experimentation and the scientific method. A crucial technological catalyst for this intellectual boom and the proliferation of books in the Islamic world was the relatively early adoption and widespread use of paper-making technology, which had originated in China. Paper, made from plant fibers such as linen, hemp, or mulberry bark, was significantly cheaper, lighter, and easier to produce in large quantities than parchment, and more convenient than papyrus, which was largely confined to Egypt. The technology is traditionally said to have reached the Islamic world in the mid-8th century, following the Battle of Talas, 751 CE, in Central Asia, where Arab forces defeated a Chinese Tang dynasty army and allegedly captured Chinese prisoners of war who possessed paper-making skills. Samarkand, in modern-day Uzbekistan, became an early and important center for paper production, and the technology quickly spread westward across the Islamic Empire, with paper mills established in Baghdad, Damascus, Cairo, Fez, and eventually Islamic Spain, Al-Andalus, by the 10th and 11th centuries. The availability of affordable paper fueled an explosion in book production, correspondence, and literacy. Libraries, both large public or semi-public institutions, often attached to mosques, madrasas, or palaces, and extensive private collections, belonging to scholars, officials, and wealthy merchants, flourished across the Islamic world. These were not just in Baghdad, but also in cities like Cordoba in Al-Andalus, which under the Umayyad Caliph al-Hakam II in the 10th century boasted a magnificent palace library said to contain hundreds of thousands of volumes, meticulously cataloged and staffed by librarians and copyists. Cairo, under the Fatimids, also had impressive libraries such as the Dar al-Ilm, House of Knowledge. Other cities like Damascus, Aleppo, Nishapur, Bukhara, and Samarkand also became renowned centers of learning with significant libraries. These libraries often had sophisticated systems of organization, classification, sometimes based on subject categories, lending policies, and even in some cases, forms of interlibrary loan. They served as vibrant hubs for scholarship, education, and intellectual exchange. Back in Western Europe, as the High Middle Ages dawned, roughly from the 11th to the 13th centuries, conditions began to stabilize and gradually improve. Agricultural innovations like the heavy plow, the three-field system, and the horse collar led to increased food production and population growth. Trade networks revived, both locally and long distance, with the Byzantine Empire and the Islamic world, via Italy and Spain. Urban centers, which had declined significantly in the early Middle Ages, began to reemerge and grow in size and importance. This period witnessed the rise of cathedral schools, attached to major cathedrals and run by clergy. These schools, such as those at Chartres, Paris, Rennes, and Lyon, provided a more advanced level of education than most monastic schools, often focusing on training clergy for diocesan administration, but also attracting lay students. They played a crucial role in the intellectual revival of the 11th and 12th centuries, particularly in the study of logic, dialectic, and theology. And, most significantly for the long-term history of knowledge and higher education, the first universities began to appear in Europe during this period. The University of Bologna, which emerged from earlier law schools and gained renown for its specialization in Roman and canon law, is often considered the oldest continuously operating university in the Western world, with its origins in the late 11th century. The University of Paris, which grew out of the Cathedral School of Notre Dame and other Parisian schools, became preeminent in theology and philosophy in the 12th and 13th centuries. These were soon followed by the University of Oxford and then Cambridge in England, and later by universities in other parts of Europe like Padua, Naples, Salamanca, Montpellier, and Coimbra. These new institutions, with their corporate structures, faculties, degrees, and emphasis on systematic inquiry, created vibrant and often boisterous intellectual communities and a surging, unprecedented demand for books. University libraries began to form, though they were initially quite modest collections, often consisting of donations from benefactors or bequests from masters. Books were still incredibly precious commodities, as each one had to be painstakingly handwritten on expensive parchment or vellum, a process that could take months or even years for a single substantial volume. To prevent theft and ensure their availability for study, books in university libraries, as well as in many monastic libraries of the period, were often physically chained to lecterns, desks, or shelves. This practice of chained libraries, while seeming restrictive to us today, actually reflected the immense value of books and the desire to make them accessible, albeit in a controlled manner, to the members of the scholarly community. The curriculum in these early universities was largely based on the 7 liberal arts, the trivium, grammar, rhetoric, logic, and the quadrivium, arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, music, which formed the foundation of learning and then progressed to the higher faculties of law, both civil and canon, medicine and theology, considered the queen of the sciences. This curriculum, particularly the scholastic method of teaching and learning that came to dominate university education, relied heavily on the close reading, detailed analysis, logical disputation, and reconciliation of authoritative texts, primarily the works of Aristotle, whose logical, physical, metaphysical, and ethical writings became central to the curriculum, supplemented by commentators like Averroes and Avicenna, known in Latinized forms, Roman law texts like Justinian's Corpus Juris Civilis, medical texts, Galen, Hippocrates, and Avicenna's canon, and of course the Bible and the writings of the Church Fathers. This intense focus on textual authority and dialectical reasoning created a constant demand for accurate and accessible copies of these core texts. To meet this demand, a system known as the Pichia system developed around many universities, particularly in Paris and Bologna. Under this system, officially approved master copies, exemplars, of frequently used textbooks were divided into sections or quires, pichii. These pichii were then deposited with licensed stationers, booksellers, who would rent them out, one section at a time, to professional scribes or even to students, allowing for multiple copies of a book to be produced relatively quickly and simultaneously by different copyists. This system helped to ensure a degree of textual accuracy, as the exemplars were supposedly vetted by university authorities, and increased the speed and availability of essential academic texts, though it was still a far cry from the mass production that would later be possible with printing. The new mendicant orders, the Franciscans and Dominicans, founded in the early 13th century, also became deeply involved in university life and scholarship, establishing their own study houses, studia generalia, in university towns and producing many leading theologians and philosophers such as Thomas Aquinas, Dominican, and Bonaventure, Franciscan. They too built up significant libraries to support their educational and preaching missions. The late Middle Ages and the early Renaissance, roughly spanning the 14th to the early 16th centuries, witnessed a burgeoning and transformative intellectual and cultural movement, particularly in Italy, known as humanism. Humanism was characterized by a renewed and passionate interest in the classical art, literature, and philosophy of ancient Greece and Rome. Humanist scholars like Francesco Petrarca, Petrarch, 1304-1374, and Giovanni Boccaccio, 1313-1375, in Italy believed that the study of classical antiquity, the studia humanitatis, humanities, which included grammar, rhetoric, poetry, history, and moral philosophy based on classical authors, offered profound insights into human nature and a model for eloquence, virtue, and civic life. They became avid and often obsessive manuscript hunters, scouring monastic libraries, cathedral archives, and other often remote or neglected repositories across Europe in search of lost or forgotten classical texts. Poggio Bracciolini, 1380-1459, an Italian humanist and papal secretary, was particularly successful in this endeavor, famously rediscovering complete manuscripts or significant portions of works by authors such as Lucretius, his philosophical poem De Rerum Natura, Quintilian, his treatise on rhetoric, Institutio Oratoria, Vitruvius on architecture, and several of Cicero's lost orations, often in dusty and forgotten corners of monasteries in Switzerland, Germany, and France. This fervent quest to recover the literary and philosophical heritage of Greece and Rome, and to produce more accurate and elegant Latin, fueled a new wave of scholarship, textual criticism, translation, especially of Greek texts into Latin, and artistic creativity, laying the foundations for the broader cultural transformations of the Renaissance. This period also saw the growth of magnificent and highly influential private libraries assembled by powerful nobles, wealthy merchant families, and high-ranking clergy who were patrons of humanist learning. The Medici family in Florence, particularly Cosimo de' Medici, 1389-1464, and his grandson Lorenzo the Magnificent, 1449-1492, were preeminent in this regard. They amassed an extraordinary collection of classical and humanist manuscripts, employing scholars and scribes to acquire, copy, and study them. This collection formed the nucleus of the Laurentian Library, Bibliotheca Medicea Laurentiana, in Florence, which was later housed in a stunning building designed by Michelangelo. Other notable Renaissance libraries included the splendid library of Federico da Montefeltro, Duke of Urbino, 1422-1482, whose library was renowned for its collection of beautifully illuminated manuscripts, all handwritten. He famously disdained printed books for his personal collection. And the Bibliotheca Corviniana of King Matthias Corvinus of Hungary, 1443-1490, which was one of the largest and most diverse libraries in Europe at the time, containing many Greek and Latin classics. The Vatican Library in Rome, though with ancient roots dating back to the 4th century, was effectively refounded and significantly expanded by humanist popes like Nicholas Viviers, reigned 1447-1455, who envisioned it as a great public library for scholars. He dispatched agents to acquire manuscripts from across Europe and the Byzantine East, making the Vatican Library one of the world's most important research libraries for classical and ecclesiastical texts, a position it still holds today. But the most profoundly transformative, society-altering, and knowledge-democratizing event in the entire history of information technology, an invention that would overshadow even the invention of writing itself in its impact, was poised to unfold in the mid-15th century. Around the year 1440, in the city of Mainz in the Rhineland region of Germany, a skilled goldsmith, metallurgist, and inventor named Johannes Gutenberg, born Johannes Gensfleisch zur Laden zum Gutenberg, circa 1400-1468, perfected his revolutionary invention of mechanical movable type printing. While forms of printing, such as woodblock printing, where an entire page of text and images was carved onto a single block of wood, inked, and then pressed onto paper, had existed for centuries, particularly in East Asia, China, Korea, and Japan, and while experiments with movable type made from clay or wood had also occurred in China, Bisheng in the 11th century, and Korea, where metal movable type was developed by the 13th century, and used for royal publications. Gutenberg's innovation was a unique and powerful combination of several key elements that made mass production feasible and economically viable in a European context. These elements included individual reusable letter forms, movable type, cast with precision in metal, an alloy of lead, tin, and antimony, using hand molds, an oil-based ink that was viscous enough to adhere effectively to the metal type and transfer cleanly to paper, and a modified screw press, adapted from existing wine or olive presses, that could apply strong and even pressure to transfer the inked type image onto sheets of paper or vellum. This combination allowed for the relatively rapid, accurate, and inexpensive mass production of texts in a way that had never before been possible. The impact of Gutenberg's printing press was nothing short of earth-shattering and immediate. It was a technological revolution that touched and ultimately reshaped every aspect of European society, religion, politics, science, education, commerce, and culture, and eventually the entire world. Before Gutenberg, as we've seen, producing even a single copy of a book was an arduous, time-consuming, and expensive process that could take months or even years of highly skilled manual labor by a scribe. With the printing press, hundreds or even thousands of largely identical copies of a text could be produced in a matter of weeks or months. The first major and most famous work printed by Gutenberg using his new technology was the Gutenberg Bible, also known as the 42-line Bible, a magnificent two-volume edition of the Latin Vulgate, completed around 1455. Approximately 180 copies are thought to have been printed, a remarkable number for the time. The consequences of this invention spread with astonishing rapidity. Within a few decades, printing presses had been established in cities across Germany, Italy, France, Spain, the Netherlands, England, and beyond. The price of books plummeted dramatically, perhaps by as much as 80% or more compared to handwritten manuscripts, making them accessible to a much wider segment of the population, including the burgeoning urban middle classes, artisans, and even some prosperous peasants, not just the wealthy elite and the clergy. Literacy rates, though still relatively low by modern standards and varying greatly by region and social class, began a steady and sustained ascent as more people had access to affordable reading materials and the incentives to learn to read. Information, ideas, news, and propaganda could now spread with unprecedented speed, geographical reach, and popular penetration. The Protestant Reformation, ignited by Martin Luther in the early 16th century. His 95 Theses were famously posted in 1517, was profoundly fueled and arguably made possible by the printing press. Luther's theological arguments, his translations of the Bible into vernacular German, which became a bestseller and helped to standardize the German language, and countless polemical pamphlets, sermons, and woodcut illustrations were printed in vast quantities and distributed widely, challenging the authority of the established Roman Catholic Church and mobilizing popular support in a way that would have been inconceivable before the age of print. The Catholic Church, in turn, also utilized the press for its counter-Reformation efforts. The scientific revolution of the 16th and 17th centuries, which transformed humanity's understanding of the natural world, was also accelerated, shaped, and disseminated by the printing press. Scientists like Nicholas Copernicus, whose groundbreaking work, De Revolutionibus Orbium Coelestium, on the revolutions of the heavenly spheres, published in 1543, proposed a heliocentric model of the universe. Andreas Vesalius, whose De Humani Coit Corporis Fabrica, on the fabric of the human body, also published in 1543, provided revolutionary detailed anatomical illustrations based on human dissection, and later figures like Johannes Kepler, Galileo Galilei, whose telescopic observations and defense of Copernicanism were widely publicized through print, leading to his conflict with the Church, and Isaac Newton, whose Principia Mathematica, 60 to 87, laid the foundations of classical mechanics and universal gravitation, could disseminate their findings, theories, experimental data, and mathematical proofs to a broad international scholarly community. This facilitated peer review, the replication of experiments, the correction of errors, and the cumulative collaborative building of scientific knowledge. The standardization of texts, a crucial byproduct of printing multiple identical copies from the same set type, was also of immense importance for scholarly accuracy, textual criticism, and scientific communication, as scholars in different locations could be confident they were referring to the same version of a work. The ability to include accurate and repeatable diagrams, maps, and mathematical formulas in printed books was also a significant advantage. Libraries naturally began a profound and multifaceted transformation in the age of print. While precious and unique manuscript collections continued to be valued, preserved, and studied, printed books started to fill their shelves in ever-increasing numbers, often overwhelming existing storage and cataloging systems. The very nature of scholarship and library use began to shift. Instead of relying on a few rare, often error-prone and geographically dispersed manuscripts, scholars could now consult multiple, largely identical, and more readily available copies of texts. This facilitated comparative analysis, the development of critical editions, and more rigorous textual scholarship. National libraries, or their direct precursors, began to emerge and grow significantly in size and importance, often benefiting from the new technology. The Bibliothèque nationale de France, for example, which originated from the French Royal Library of Charles V in the 14th century, saw its collections expand enormously with the advent of printing and, crucially, the implementation of legal deposit laws. These laws, first appearing in France in 1537, the Ordonnance de Montpellier, and gradually adopted in other European countries, required printers or publishers to submit one or more copies of every published work to a designated national repository, like the Royal Library. This ensured the systematic preservation of the nation's literary and intellectual output and formed the basis for comprehensive national bibliographies. The Bodleian Library at the University of Oxford, effectively refounded by the diplomat and scholar Sir Thomas Bodley in the late 16th and early 17th centuries, also grew rapidly, benefiting from Bodley's energetic fundraising, his extensive network of contacts for acquiring books, and a landmark agreement he made with the Stationers' Company in London in 1610, which granted the Bodleian the right to receive a free copy of every book printed by members of the company. The concept of the Republic of Letters, Res Publica Literaria, an international informal community of scholars and intellectuals connected through correspondence, travel, and the exchange of printed works, flourished during this period of intellectual ferment, with libraries serving as crucial nodes and resources within this transnational network. However, the immense power of the printing press to disseminate ideas also alarmed both secular and religious authorities, who feared its potential to spread heresy, sedition, and dissent. This led to increased efforts at censorship and control over what could be printed and circulated. The Roman Catholic Church, for example, established the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, list of prohibited books, in 1559, which identified texts deemed heretical or dangerous to faith and morals, and which remained in force in various forms until 1966. Secular rulers also implemented systems of licensing for printers and pre-publication censorship. The 17th and 18th centuries, often characterized by historians as the Age of Enlightenment in Europe, or more broadly, the Age of Reason, witnessed a further unprecedented explosion in publishing activity and a growing philosophical belief in the power of human reason. Empirical observation, scientific inquiry, and the widespread dissemination of knowledge to improve society challenged dogma and superstition, promote progress, and secure individual liberties. Influential thinkers like John Locke in England, whose Two Treatises of Government, 1689, articulated ideas on natural rights, consent of the governed, and limited government that profoundly influenced political thought in Britain and America. Voltaire, François-Marie Arouet in France, a fierce and witty advocate for freedom of speech, religious tolerance, and reason against fanaticism. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, whose writings on social contract theory, The Social Contract, 1762, and Education, Émile, 1762, were revolutionary and controversial. Montesquieu, who advocated for the separation of powers in government, and the encyclopédistes in France, led by Denis Diderot and Jean-Laurent d'Alembert, who, in their monumental encyclopédie, ou Dictionnaire raisonné des sciences, des arts, et des métiers, encyclopedia, or a systematic dictionary of the sciences, arts, and crafts, published between 1751 and 1772, aimed to compile, organize, and disseminate all current human knowledge in a critical and accessible format. All of these figures and intellectual movements relied heavily on the power of the printed word to spread their influential and often challenging ideas across Europe and its colonies. These ideas, in turn, played a significant role in fueling revolutionary movements in America, the American Revolution, 1775-1783, and France, the French Revolution, 1789-1799. During this dynamic era of intellectual ferment and social change, libraries became increasingly viewed not just as repositories for scholarly research or symbols of elite culture, but as potentially powerful public goods, essential for fostering an informed, enlightened, and virtuous citizenry capable of participating in self-government. While university libraries, like those at Leiden, Göttingen, and Harvard, and national libraries, like the British Museum Library, founded in 1753, which later became the British Library, continued to develop and expand their collections. New forms of libraries emerged to cater to a broader and more diverse readership. Subscription libraries, where members paid an annual or quarterly fee to borrow books from a collectively owned collection, became increasingly popular in cities and towns across Europe and North America. Benjamin Franklin, a quintessential Enlightenment figure, played a key role in establishing the Library Company of Philadelphia in 1731, one of the earliest and most successful subscription libraries in the American colonies, which served as a model for many others. These libraries often reflected the intellectual interests of their members, stocking works of history, philosophy, science, travel, and literature. Circulating libraries, which were typically commercial ventures run by booksellers or entrepreneurs, also proliferated, particularly in the late 18th and 19th centuries. These often focused on more popular genres, especially novels, which were rapidly gaining popularity, as well as magazines and light reading, and they played a significant role in expanding reading habits and literary culture among the growing middle classes, including women, who were often prominent patrons of these institutions. The idea of the library as a truly public institution, freely accessible to all members of a community, regardless of social standing or ability to pay, was slowly but surely taking root, laying the essential groundwork for the widespread development of tax-supported public libraries in the 19th century. The French Revolution, while leading to the unfortunate destruction or dispersal of some aristocratic and monastic libraries, also resulted in the confiscation of their vast collections by the state and the creation of new national and local departmental repositories with the revolutionary ideal, at least in principle, of making knowledge accessible to all citizens of the new republic. This led to the concept of the Bibliothèque municipale, municipal library, in France. The 19th century was a period of unprecedented and transformative growth, diversification, and professionalization for libraries, particularly in the Western world. The Industrial Revolution, which had begun in Britain in the late 18th century and spread across Europe and North America during the 19th, brought about further profound technological advancements in printing and papermaking. The invention of the steam-powered printing press by Friedrich Koenig in the early 1810s, followed by the rotary press, developed by Richard Hoe in the 1840s, and later the linotype, Ottmar Mergen-Haller, 1880s, and monotype, Tolbert Lanston, 1880s machines for automated typesetting, dramatically increased the speed and reduced the cost of producing books, newspapers, and periodicals. Simultaneously, the development of methods for making paper from wood pulp in the mid-19th century, rather than from scarce and expensive cotton or linen rags, made paper much cheaper and more abundant, though often less durable in the longs, termed due to its higher acidity. These innovations led to a veritable flood of affordable printed materials, catering to a rapidly expanding market. Concurrently, mass education movements in many Western countries, driven by a combination of industrial needs, democratic ideals, and religious or philanthropic motives, led to significant increases in basic literacy rates, creating a vast new audience with a growing hunger for reading materials and information. This powerful confluence of technological advancement, increased literacy, and democratic sentiment fueled the modern public library movement, which gained significant momentum, particularly in Great Britain and the United States, during the second half of the 19th century. In Britain, the Public Libraries Act of 1850, championed by figures like William Ewart and Edward Edwards, the first librarian of the Manchester Free Library, allowed local boroughs to levy a small tax to establish and maintain free public libraries accessible to all residents. This legislation, though initially permissive and limited in its funding, laid the foundation for a national network of public libraries. In the United States, the public library movement also gained traction, with early examples like the Boston Public Library, founded in 1848 and opened in 1854, which was established with the explicit aim of providing educational opportunities for all citizens. Philanthropists played a pivotal and often decisive role in this movement. None was more influential or prolific in his support than Andrew Carnegie, the Scottish-American industrialist who amassed a vast fortune in the steel industry. Between the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Carnegie, guided by his gospel of wealth philosophy, donated enormous sums of money, equivalent to billions of dollars in today's currency, to fund the construction of over 2,500 public library buildings across the English-speaking world, including in the United States, Britain, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. Carnegie typically provided funds for the building on the condition that the local municipality would agree to stock it with books and provide for its ongoing maintenance and staffing. He believed passionately that access to knowledge and opportunities for self-education were key to individual advancement and societal progress, and he saw free public libraries as universities of the people, essential tools for democracy and social mobility. Many of these Carnegie libraries, often grand and imposing structures, still serve their communities today. With the explosive growth in the sheer number of books being published and the proliferation of libraries of all types, the need for a more systematic, efficient, and standardized methods of organizing and accessing these burgeoning collections became increasingly acute. This led to the development and widespread adoption of formal library classification systems. Melville Dewey, Melville Louis Kossuth Dewey, an American librarian and educator, published the first edition of his Dewey Decimal Classification, DDC, system anonymously in 1876. The DDC, with its hierarchical structure dividing all human knowledge into 10 main classes, 099, each further subdivided by decimals to achieve greater specificity, offered a relatively simple, logical, and adaptable system for arranging books by subject. It was widely adopted by public and school libraries, particularly in the United States and other English-speaking countries, and is still in use in many parts of the world today, albeit in greatly expanded and revised editions. Charles Amé. Cutter, another influential American librarian, developed his Cutter expansive classification system around the same time, published between 1891 and 1903. While less widely adopted in its entirety than DDC, Cutter's system, with its emphasis on alphabetical subject headings and author marks, significantly influenced other classification schemes and cataloging practices, particularly the development of subject headings. At the turn of the 20th century, the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C., the de facto National Library of the United States, began to develop its own comprehensive classification system, the Library of Congress Classification, LCC. The LCC was primarily designed to organize the library's own vast and rapidly growing collections, which covered all fields of knowledge. It uses an alphanumeric notation and is generally more enumerative and detailed than DDC, making it particularly well-suited for large academic and research libraries. The LCC became the standard classification system for most such libraries in North America and has been adopted by many research libraries worldwide. The development of these standardized classification systems, along with standardized cataloging rules, such as those developed by Cutter and later codified in Anglo-American cataloging rules, was essential for providing intellectual access to collections and for facilitating interlibrary cooperation. Librarianship itself began to emerge and consolidate as a distinct profession during this period, moving beyond the earlier, often part-time, model of the scholar librarian or the gentleman curator. Formal training programs and library schools were established to educate librarians in the principles and practices of library management, cataloging, classification, and user services. Melville Dewey played a key role here as well, founding the first formal library school at Columbia College, now Columbia University, in New York City in 1887. Other library schools soon followed in the United States and Europe. Professional associations were also formed to promote the interests of libraries and librarians, to develop standards and best practices, and to advocate for the role of libraries in society. The American Library Association, ALA, was founded in 1876, the same year Dewey published his DDC, and the Library Association, LA, in the United Kingdom, was established in 1877, now CILIP, the Chartered Institute of Library and Information Professionals. These organizations played a crucial role in shaping the development of the modern library profession. The focus of librarianship gradually shifted and broadened from an overwhelming, almost exclusive emphasis on the acquisition, collection, and physical preservation of materials to include a much greater emphasis on providing access to information, delivering user-centered services, offering reader guidance and reference assistance, and promoting literacy and lifelong learning within the community. The 20th century presented libraries and the ongoing endeavor of knowledge preservation with both unprecedented, devastating challenges and profoundly transformative opportunities. The two world wars, 1914, 1918, and 1939, 1945, brought about the destruction of libraries, archives, and cultural heritage on a scale never before witnessed in human history. The deliberate burning of the historic library of the Catholic University of Leuven in Belgium by German forces during World War I, and its tragic, almost identical destruction again by German forces in World War II, became potent and enduring, symbols of cultural barbarism and the extreme vulnerability of knowledge in times of total conflict. Countless other libraries and archives across Europe and Asia suffered immense losses through aerial bombing, e.g., the British Museum Library in London, libraries in Dresden, Tokyo, and many other cities, shelling, looting, and deliberate destruction by occupying forces. The Nazi regime in Germany in particular engaged in systematic looting of Jewish libraries and archives, as well as the infamous book burnings of works deemed un-German or ideologically undesirable. Yet these devastating conflicts also spurred remarkable and often heroic efforts to protect, salvage, and reconstruct collections. Librarians and archivists undertook dangerous work to evacuate valuable materials to safer locations, to microfilm important records, and to document losses. The Monuments Men, formerly the Monuments, Fine Arts, and Archives program of the Allied armies, during and after World War II, a dedicated group of art historians, archivists, museum curators, and librarians worked tirelessly to identify, track, recover, and restitute millions of cultural items, including books, manuscripts, and archives that had been looted by the Nazis from across occupied Europe. Post-war efforts, such as the Inter-Allied Book Center in London, aimed to collect salvaged books and redistribute them to war-damaged libraries. The Cold War era also presented its own challenges, with ideological censorship and restrictions on access to information in many parts of the world. Technological advancements continued to reshape the landscape of libraries and information management throughout the 20th century. Microfilm and microfiche, which had been developed earlier but became widely adopted in the mid-20th century, offered a practical means to preserve and distribute fragile or bulky materials, such as old newspapers, which were often printed on acidic and rapidly deteriorating paper, rare manuscripts, extensive archival records, and academic theses in a compact and relatively durable format. This technology was also used extensively for espionage, e.g. microdots, and for securing vital records during wartime and the Cold War. The advent of computers in the latter half of the century began to revolutionize library operations profound ways, initially with the automation of cataloging and circulation systems. The development of the MARC, machine-readable cataloging format at the Library of Congress in the 1960s was a landmark achievement. MARC provided a standardized way to encode bibliographic data, author, title, subject, publication information, etc., in a format that could be processed by computers. This allowed libraries to create electronic catalog records, to share these records with other libraries, and to build large cooperative bibliographic databases or utilities like OCLC, Online Computer Library Center, founded in 1967 as the WAMA Ohio College Library Center, and RLG, Research Libraries Group, with its RLIN database. This shared cataloging greatly reduced the duplication of effort and improved the consistency and accessibility of bibliographic information. This was followed by the development of early OPACs, online public access catalogs, in the 1970s and 1980s, which gradually replaced traditional card catalogs and allowed library users to search their library's collections digitally for the first time, using keywords and various search parameters. The sheer exponential volume of information being produced, globally often termed the information explosion or information overload, became a defining characteristic and a major challenge of the post-World War II era. The rapid growth of scientific research and development, academic publishing, the publish or perish phenomenon, government documentation, and mass media created immense challenges for indexing, abstracting, retrieving, and managing this deluge of information. The concept of information science emerged as a distinct interdisciplinary field in the mid-20th century, drawing on and integrating elements of library science, computer science, documentation, linguistics, cognitive psychology, and communication. Studies. Information science sought to study the theoretical underpinnings and practical applications of how information is created, organized, stored, retrieved, processed, disseminated, and used by individuals and organizations. Visionary thinkers like Vannevar Bush, an American engineer and science administrator, in his seminal and remarkably prescient 1945 article, As We May Think, published in the Atlantic Monthly, foresaw the growing challenges of information overload for researchers and proposed a conceptual device called the MEMEX. The MEMEX was envisioned as a personal desk-sized electromechanical device that could store, retrieve, and link vast amounts of information, books, records, communications, in a nonlinear associative way, prefiguring many aspects of hypertext, personal computers, and the World Wide Web. How could any individual scholar, scientist, or citizen effectively navigate, filter, evaluate, and make sense of the ever-expanding, overwhelming ocean of published material and data? This pressing question and the search for solutions set the stage for the next, and arguably most profound and disruptive, transformation in the long history of knowledge and its preservation. And then came the digital age. The late 20th and early 21st centuries have witnessed a paradigm shift in the creation, dissemination, access, and preservation of knowledge that is as radical, far-reaching, and transformative in its implications as the invention of writing in antiquity or the advent of the printing press in the Renaissance. The convergence and rapid proliferation of the Internet, the World Wide Web, invented by Tim Berners-Lee at CERN in 1989-90, powerful and affordable personal computers, sophisticated search engines, and ubiquitous mobile devices, smartphones, and tablets have fundamentally and irrevocably altered how we, as individuals and as a global society, create, share, discover, interact with, and attempt to preserve information. The very concept of the library, its functions, and its physical form has expanded and evolved far beyond its traditional association with physical buildings housing collections of tangible books and other materials. Digital libraries began to emerge, initially as experimental or specialized projects. Project Gutenberg, founded by the visionary Michael S. Hart in 1971, even before the Internet, as we commonly know it using ARPANET, was an incredibly idealistic and pioneering endeavor. Hart's ambitious goal was to create free, publicly accessible, electronic versions, e-texts, of books that were in the public domain, starting with the U.S. Declaration of Independence, which he typed into a mainframe computer. His aim was to make literature and important historical documents universally accessible to anyone with a computer and an internet connection. Project Gutenberg continues its work today with tens of thousands of volunteer-produced ebooks available. The Internet Archive, founded by entrepreneur and digital librarian Brewster Cayley in 1996, embarked on an even more audacious and comprehensive mission to archive the entire public Internet through its Wayback Machine, which periodically crawls and saves snapshots of websites, alongside digitizing millions of books, music recordings, films, television programs, software, and other cultural artifacts with the explicit and inspiring aim of providing universal access to all knowledge. Google Books, launched in 2004, initially as Google Print, later Google Book Search, undertook a massive and highly controversial project to digitally scan millions of books from the collections of major research libraries around the world, including institutions like Harvard, Stanford, Oxford, and the New York Public Library. The goal was to make the full text of these books searchable online, providing unprecedented access to a vast corpus of world literature and scholarship. This project, while lauded by many for its potential to democratize access, also led to significant and protracted legal battles with authors groups and publishers associations over copyright infringement, particularly concerning the scanning and display of in-copyright books and the status of orphan works, copyrighted works whose rights holders are difficult or impossible to identify. These legal challenges highlighted the complex tensions between copyright law, fair use principles, and the public interest in accessing information in the digital age. Search engines, preeminently Google, founded in 1998, but also others like Bing and DuckDuckGo, rapidly became the primary gateway to information for a vast majority of people globally, offering seemingly instantaneous access to a bewilderingly infinite and constantly changing ocean of data, documents, images, videos, and media. Academic journals, the primary vehicle for disseminating scholarly research, increasingly moved online, often behind expensive subscription paywalls, maintained by large commercial publishers, creating an serials crisis for library budgets. This, in turn, fueled a growing and influential open access movement, advocating for various models, e.g., gold open access journals, green open access repositories, to provide free, unrestricted, and immediate online access to peer-reviewed scholarly research, thereby maximizing its societal impact. Museums, archives, and libraries worldwide embarked on large-scale digitization projects, making high-resolution digital images of rare manuscripts, historical photographs, priceless artworks, unique archival materials, and sound recordings accessible to a global audience, transcending geographical, physical, and often economic barriers to access. Initiatives like Europeana, the Digital Public Library of America, DPLA, and numerous institutional digital repositories have made vast cultural heritage collections available online. The benefits of this digital revolution in information access are undeniable, manifold, and truly transformative. We now have unprecedented, often instantaneous, access to a greater volume and variety of information than at any previous point in human history. This fosters a potential for the democratization of knowledge on a scale previously unimaginable, empowering individuals and communities worldwide. Complex searches across vast datasets and full-text corpora can be performed in seconds, enabling new forms of research and discovery. New scholarly methodologies, such as distant reading, analyzing large literary corpora for patterns, and computational analysis of large datasets in the sciences and humanities, have become possible. Researchers can collaborate seamlessly across continents in real time, sharing data and co-authoring publications. Students in remote or underserved communities can, in theory, access high-quality educational resources and primary source materials that were once available only to scholars. At elite, well-funded institutions in major metropolitan centers, individuals with disabilities can benefit from assistive technologies that provide access to digital content in alternative formats. However, the digital age also presents formidable, complex, and often novel challenges for the long-term preservations and reliable stewardship of knowledge. Digital information, despite its apparent immateriality and ease of duplication, can be surprisingly fragile, vulnerable, and ephemeral. One major challenge is bit rot, or data degradation, where the physical media on which digital information is stored, e.g., hard drives, magnetic tapes, optical discs, can degrade over time, leading to corruption or loss of data. File formats become obsolete as software and hardware evolve. Data created in older proprietary formats may become unreadable without specialized and often unavailable software or hardware, effectively locking away the information. Think of data stored on 8-inch floppy disks or documents created in long-defunct word processing programs. Hardware itself inevitably degrades and becomes obsolete. Hard drives crash, servers fail, and older storage devices are no longer manufactured or supported. The phenomenon of link rot, where hyperlinks on the World Wide Web cease to point to their original targets because websites are restructured, moved, or taken down, and content drift, where the content at a given URL changes significantly over time without notice, means that the web is a constantly shifting, unstable, and unreliable information landscape. Ensuring robust, authentic, and accessible long-term digital preservation requires continuous active management strategies, significant ongoing financial investment, and constant technological adaptation and innovation. This includes practices like data migration, periodically moving digital objects to new formats or storage media, emulation, recreating the original hardware-software environment to access older files, and the development of trusted digital repositories with robust preservation policies and infrastructure. This is a far cry from the relative stability of a baked clay tablet that can survive millennia buried in the earth, or a parchment manuscript that can last for many centuries in a stable, controlled environment with relatively minimal active intervention. Furthermore, the digital environment poses new and amplified challenges to information veracity, intellectual authority, and critical discernment. The ease, speed, and low cost with which information, and indeed misinformation, disinformation, and propaganda can be created, manipulated, and disseminated online, often anonymously or under false pretenses, means that critical thinking, skills, media literacy, digital literacy, and the ability to rigorously evaluate sources and evidence are more crucial than ever for informed citizenship and decision-making. The proliferation of fake news, hoaxes, conspiracy theories, and algorithmically amplified content within personalized filter bubbles and ideologically homogeneous echo chambers, often created by social media platforms and search engine. Algorithms can limit individuals' exposure to diverse perspectives, exacerbate societal polarization, erode trust in legitimate institutions and expertise, and even undermine democratic processes. Copyright and intellectual property issues in the digital realm remain incredibly complex and are subject to ongoing legal, ethical, and economic debate. Issues such as digital rights management, DRM technologies, which can restrict access and use of digital content, the scope of fair use or fair dealing in a digital context, the licensing of ebooks and electronic journals, often involving restrictive terms of use rather than outright ownership, and the challenges of preserving access to orphan works continue to be contentious. The digital divide also remains a persistent and significant global concern, with substantial disparities in access to affordable and reliable internet connectivity, appropriate digital devices, and essential digital literacy skills. These disparities exist not only between developed and developing nations, the global digital divide, but also within countries based on socioeconomic status, geographic location, urban versus rural, age, education level, and other demographic factors, creating new forms of information inequality and potentially exacerbating existing social and economic inequalities. Libraries today, in all their diverse forms, public, academic, school, special, national, are at the very forefront of grappling with these multifaceted challenges while simultaneously continuing to evolve, adapt, and redefine their essential roles and services in the complex landscape of the 21st century. They are no longer, if they ever solely were, just quiet, passive repositories of books and other physical artifacts. Modern libraries are dynamic, vibrant, and essential community hubs. They are vital centers for promoting digital literacy and critical thinking skills. They are crucial providers of free and equitable access to computers, high-speed internet, and other digital technologies. They are increasingly becoming maker spaces or innovation labs equipped with tools like 3D printers, laser cutters, and software for creative exploration and skill development. And they remain trusted, neutral, and welcoming institutions for navigating the complexities of the information age and for fostering lifelong learning and civic engagement. Librarians, in turn, are increasingly taking on new and expanded roles as information navigators, educators, digital curators, data management specialists, community facilitators, and staunch advocates for intellectual freedom, privacy, and equitable access to information for all. They curate and preserve complex digital collections, including born digital materials, those created in digital form from the outset. They design and deliver training programs on information literacy, digital citizenship, and research skills for people of all ages and backgrounds. They help users navigate complex proprietary databases, open educational resources, and the often chaotic landscape of the open web. And they play a crucial and often unsung role in preserving local history, community memory, and diverse cultural heritage in both physical and digital formats, the very definition of what constitutes knowledge or cultural heritage worthy of preservation is also expanding and becoming more inclusive in the digital age. We are now grappling with the significant technical, ethical, and conceptual challenges of how to archive, preserve, and ensure long-term access to increasingly complex and dynamic digital objects. These include interactive websites and web applications, large and complex scientific data sets, software and source code, video games, which are increasingly recognized as significant cultural artifacts, social media content, which captures contemporary social and political discourse, and even immersive virtual and augmented reality experiences. How do you effectively preserve an algorithm or the interactive experience of a massively multiplayer online role-playing game, MMORPG, or the ephemeral content of a constantly updating social media feed? These are active and challenging areas of research and development in the fields of digital preservation, archival science, and information studies, posing significant questions about selection, appraisal, authenticity, context, and access. Looking towards the future, emerging and rapidly advancing technologies like artificial intelligence, AI, and machine learning are poised to further transform how we create, discover, interact with, analyze, and preserve information. AI could potentially assist with automated metadata generation and cataloging at scale, power more sophisticated, intuitive, and personalized search and discovery tools, facilitate the automated analysis, summarization, and translation of vast quantities of text and data, and even contribute to the generation of new knowledge by identifying novel patterns, correlations, and insights within existing large data sets. Linked data initiatives and the concept of the semantic web, envisioned by Tim Berners-Lee and others, promise a more interconnected, intelligent, and machine-readable web of information where data is structured and linked in ways that enhance discoverability, contextual understanding, and interoperability. Decentralized technologies, such as blockchain, with its potential for creating immutable records and verifying provenance, and distributed file systems like IPFS, Interplanetary File System, which aims to create a more resilient and censorship-resistant web, are being explored for their potential applications in creating more robust, transparent, and democratically governed archives and knowledge repositories. Yet, amidst this whirlwind of relentless technological change and the ever-increasing complexity of the information landscape, the fundamental human impulse that has driven this entire millennia-spanning history remains remarkably constant and deeply ingrained in our nature. The innate desire to learn, to explore, to understand our world and ourselves, to remember our past, both triumphs and failures, and to share our insights, stories, and discoveries with others, both our contemporaries and the generations yet to come. From the meticulously inscribed clay tablets of ancient Sumer, holding records of harvests and hymns to gods, to the globally distributed, hyper-connected cloud servers of today, storing exabytes of human data, the unbroken thread that connects this vast and intricate historical tapestry is our species' enduring, unquenchable, and defining thirst for knowledge. The magnificent Library of Alexandria, with its dream of universal learning, may be long lost to the sands of time and the vicissitudes of history. But its ambitious spirit, its noble aspiration to encompass and make accessible all human wisdom, lives on. It echoes in the quiet dedication and daily work of every librarian, every archivist, every curator, every teacher, every researcher, and every technologist who strives to collect, organize, preserve, interpret, and provide equitable access to the vast, ever-expanding, infinitely diverse and immeasurably precious record of human experience and creativity. The long and winding journey of libraries and knowledge preservation, from the earliest pictographs to the latest algorithms, is ultimately a profound and moving testament to human ingenuity, our remarkable resilience in the face of loss, destruction, and adversity, and our collective, unceasing, and often inspiring quest for understanding, meaning, and connection. It is a story that is far from over. Indeed, it is a story that is constantly being rewritten and reimagined. We are all, whether we realize it or not, active participants, co-authors, and stakeholders in its current, rapidly evolving, and critically important chapter. The choices we make today, as individuals, as communities, as societies, and as a global civilization, about how we create, value, share, govern, and preserve information, will profoundly shape the understanding, the opportunities, the challenges, and the very consciousness of future generations, just as the tireless efforts, sacrifices, and innovations of scribes, scholars, printers, librarians, and countless other often anonymous individuals of bygone eras have shaped our own world and our own access to the accumulated wisdom of the past. It is a profound responsibility, a sacred trust, and an endlessly exciting, if sometimes daunting, adventure. The tools and technologies have changed almost beyond recognition over the centuries, from stylus and clay, to reed pen and papyrus, to quill and parchment, to movable type and paper, to typewriter and microfilm, to keyboard and code, to neural networks and perhaps one day quantum bits. But the core mission, the noble and essential endeavor, endures to ensure that the wisdom of the past, the discoveries of the present, and the diverse voices of all humanity are safeguarded, made accessible, and available to illuminate the path towards a more knowledgeable, more compassionate, more just, and hopefully, a wiser future for all. Outro music begins to swell and build gradually. Thank you from the very bottom of my heart for joining me on this extensive, detailed, and I sincerely hope, illuminating and thought-provoking journey through the millennia-spanning history of libraries and the enduring human quest for knowledge preservation. It's a topic that I am incredibly passionate about, and one that I believe speaks to the very core of what makes us human. I truly hope that you found this deep exploration as fascinating, as inspiring, and as relevant to our contemporary world as I do. Now, please, if you haven't had a chance to do so already, I would still absolutely love for you to take a moment to share a little bit about your own day, and perhaps more importantly, that one goal, whether it's big or small, personal or professional, that you're currently working towards or dreaming about for your future. Please do drop those thoughts in the comment section below. I genuinely look forward to reading each and every one of your responses and connecting with this wonderful community further. Your insights and aspirations are a valuable part of this ongoing conversation. If you found value in this deep dive, if it sparked your curiosity, taught you something new, or gave you a new appreciation for the institutions and individuals who safeguard our collective memory, please consider giving this video a thumbs up. It really does help the channel to reach a wider audience, and if you'd like to join me for more explorations like this one, delving into other fascinating aspects of history, culture, science, or ideas, please do subscribe to the channel, and perhaps click that notification bell so you don't miss out on future content. And of course, if you know someone else, a friend, a colleague, a student, a fellow enthusiast for history or libraries, who might appreciate this grand story of our collective memory and our enduring quest for knowledge, please feel free to share this video with them. Until we meet again for our next intellectual adventure, I encourage you to keep learning, keep questioning, keep exploring the world around you with curiosity and critical thought. And perhaps most importantly, in the context of today's discussion, keep valuing, supporting, and participating in the efforts to preserve the knowledge, the stories, and the diverse cultural heritage that matter to you, to your community, and to our shared human experience. Take care of yourselves, and goodbye for now.